Hello, I'm David Bradley, aka Schizophrenia. Welcome to the channel. Albert Einstein famously is quoted as saying that reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. And today I'm going to discuss why I believe and partially perceive that reality itself is in fact a hallucination. So to preface it a little bit, this idea, I'm going to refer you to a video that will be somewhere in one of these two positions in the cards on my old Schizophrenia channel, talking about life is but a dream. And the idea that I came across as a consequence of psychosis and schizophrenia, if that's what you call it, was that fundamentally, due to hallucinations and the seemingly bizarre, ever-changing nature of reality within the psychotic state, that the fundamental rules and assumptions I was making about reality were just that. They were assumptions, and that this is actually a common religious theme. So, like in Buddhism, with the idea that samsara, while samsara and nirvana are fundamentally the same reality, the samsaric version or the samsaric state of reality is illusory, and then upon awakening from that, you enter into nirvana, which is the non-illusory version of this reality. So to continue, I'm going to have to kind of describe my own notions of, so I was using this container there of samsara as the basic, you could call that I can't remember who I'm quoting this from, but the ordinary waking state of consciousness. So in a sober, ordinary, non-altered state of consciousness, there is what it's like to be in that state, and that's the most common and fundamental ground from which we're building. So below that, you can go into multiple layers of sleep and dreaming, and we'll come to that in a minute. And then beyond that, you can go into potential very large variations of what it's like to be in the waking state whilst dreaming, or whilst fundamentally being in an altered state of consciousness in some form or other. So to go down into the dream state, for example, so we start out with our sleep cycles, for example. They move cyclically, like through the circadian rhythm. So if you're having an average night's sleep, you might have like an hour and a half of deep sleep, depending how much of a sleep debt you have or how long you've been awake. And then from my personal experience of it, what emerges from that state, which is like scientists have shown, if you wake someone from a deep sleep, they appear to be and ask them what they were experiencing. It's a very, very deep state of thinking. It's a very intense but peaceful state of deep thought. Now, out of that phase, and I've had this from wake-induced lucid dreams as well, where you go immediately into dreaming, and that's quite an explosive experience. But from coming out of the deep sleep state, being disturbed, or like meditating into the deep sleep state and then observing and then carrying that through into what the burgeoning capacities of the dream state. Excuse the incense, it helps me focus. So as you emerge from the deep sleep of like this deep thought, from what little experiences I've had of this, it's as though you're kind of calculating like potential experiences that you could have, and they can be unfathomably unrealistic, or they can be deeply interrelated to kind of phantasms or like variations on your current life. So to explain that a bit further, it's as though the experience of being in the deep sleep state, consciously meditating into that state, or like focusing and keeping a relaxed, focused mind into the deep sleep state, you kind of, it's where a lot of like calculations take place. It's as though like in the deep sleep state, you're just like reorienting your psyche back to like not more fundamental, more important or less important, but like a deep state of relaxation whereby you have more objectivity towards the phenomena in reality. And then from that, it's my experience that as you complete that deep sleep cycle, which obviously from a meditative state doesn't go on quite as long, as far as I can tell, but having been woken up from deep sleep, it's a slightly different quality there. But yeah, you come out of the deep sleep state into this kind of, like, for me it was like on multiple occasions it's been like this, like a kind of opening into like a portal, or like a kind of like an expanse in the mind where this kind of calculation of the potential, or like this kind of you bring about this like fabrication that then draws you into a very initially quite, I would call it black and white, like a black and white film. It's not like a deep, vivid reality at that stage. It's like it burgeons. You can stay in that, just, I call it black and white dream state, for an extended period of time and experience no real sense that it might be real or an illusion. And then from there, some colour might come into the experience, which is associated with melatonin in the sleep state, in the same way that serotonin adds vividness to reality in the waking state. Melatonin, so that's why if you have an extended period of sleep deprivation, your dreams are a lot more vivid, because you build up the hormone melatonin in your system, and then that adds lucidity, not quite lucidity, but vividness to the dream state. And then, like, I gather from talking to a lot of people and how people describe their dreams, like, that's about as far as most people go. And it's only when you are woken from that dream by, say, an alarm or a disturbance in the room, or like the course has just run just right and you wake up a little bit, then you recall that dream. But you can simultaneously, like, if you're not disturbed and you sleep in naturally, you might find that it might be your experience that it's very foggy and very hard to detect. It was like it's something there, but you can't quite put your finger on what it was. And so that's like what I call the black and white dream state, or the like low color dream state. And then from there, this vividness can come in, this kind of the deepening of the dream state, and I postulate that actually, like, a lot of the main body of this deeper dream state, where it's vivid, is probably most people's dreams, but I don't know that for certain. But it's as though you're completely immersed in that reality, like, and it can, when you wake up from it, you can be like, that obviously wasn't real. But in the dream, you have zero conception that could be anything other than a fundamentally real reality, and there's no questioning there. And this is where, like, when people are training to lucid dream, which is the next stage, or perhaps one just beyond that, but let's for now say that's the next stage. When people are learning to lucid dream, they train themselves in the waking state to do like a watch check, or one that often triggers me is I'll check my phone and I'll pull it out, because that's something you do so often, is check your phone, like, almost compulsively. And I'll check my phone and it's like a Game Boy Advance or something, or like a fundamentally different thing, and I know really well what my phone looks like because I use it all the time. So that is often a trigger that, oh wait a minute, there's something phenomenologically bizarre about this situation. And then with training, that training yourself to stay calm when you have that revelation can deepen into this next state, which is the initial phase of lucid dreaming, which is where you realize it's a dream, but the dream continues without you having any degree of like total control and influence over it. It's simply the state of recognition that you're having a dream. And then from there, you begin to experiment. A lot of people have sex, a lot of people do bizarre things, or whatever it is they like might possibly fantasize about, in the realization that you're in a dream, but that it's not the same as the next phase, which I'm going to discuss now, which is with recurrent episodic interactions with the dream state. you learn to be calm, you learn to sustain it, and then a degree of control comes in where you can start to manifest in the way you would imagine a superhero or like Doctor Strange would. In the dream state, you can start to bring objects into existence. Like telekinesis is my absolute favorite. Pyrokinesis is another one. Extremely fun. So that's the first stage of like true lucidity, is realizing that you're in a dominion, a domain, a dimension of consciousness where with each successive time you enter it, you have a greater degree of control and or godlike powers begin to emerge. And that again is where most people stop. Similarly to the black and white phase, where most dreams are just black and white. Even for me, and I'm talking about this as from the point of experience of further levels of lucidity, most of my dreams are like just a little bit beyond the black and white dream. Like it's fundamentally accepted as reality. It's not, there's no questioning there. It's like, oh, this is an objectively valid reality that I'm experiencing, and my personality, my persona, my identity in that dream is utterly real to me in that moment. But from there we get to the next level of lucidity, which is literally godlike abilities. So like, not just like, oh, I can take the dream that's already happening to me and control it and change it. It's like you become a deity, where you're like able to like for my favorite one is so I lift up one leg, lift up the other, fly off. Loads of people fly in their dreams, like this is a really common thing. But from there I go into like this kind of, the fabric of reality starts to tear, and you be able to express your will on it in this really direct manifestation of your own desire. Now from there, there's a next phase where, so you've gone to infinite cosmic powers, but then after that, there's another phase where it takes on a kind of descriptive narrative beyond. So with you in this godlike pinnacle of ultimate control and dominion, then these other deity characters come in and start to tell you stories, much like the original dream state, but these they have the appearance, the quality, the sensation of being like you in the aligned God state of this like godlike power. Other beings of that nature come to start to tell you stories and guide you to things, and then you have these kind of magnificent long-winded stories that then I've had experiences of visiting other planets, visiting other dominions and other dimensions and other not quite dimensions, but like other godlike beings, dream worlds that they're the god of, and like having these fascinating interactions. But the memories of that for me are really limited, because they're like hyper vivid, and the vividness and the sincere feeling that you're like, okay, I'm actually interacting with, like, in the dream state, with an objectively different consciousness that is all powerful, the same as me, and we're merging and creating. Yeah, so it's very easy to wake up from that out of excitement or overwhelmedness or the beauty of it or whatever. I think that's about all I have to say on the dream dimension of motion that you can go. I don't know if I've had anything beyond that that's easy to recall. So I'll come back with the vertical axis, so rather than the upward axis rather than the downward axis of states of consciousness. Okay, so now to talk about the sort of upward or conscious state evolutionary path, of the inverse of the depths to which you can go into a dream state. So this is going to be a bit more hard to relate to, depending on what you've experienced and what altered states or what level of cognitive development. I don't mean that in a patronizing sense at all. Certainly not in a self-aggrandizing way, but in like these aren't common. They get continuously less common and relatable as this part of the conversation goes on. So the waking state of consciousness, the ordinary waking state of consciousness, I think it's Bertrand Russell, I can't remember who coined that term, but a psychologist or a psychotherapist coined that term, that we're studying altered states of consciousness. So you've got the ordinary waking state of consciousness. It's similar to, I'm going to constantly refer back to the dream states as analogous to the different states of consciousness you can access. The ordinary waking state of consciousness is just a bit beyond the black and white dream, and like depending on the experiences you've had, that vividness to life may be diminished, or it may be increased depending on quite often your emotional state, to be honest. So in that dream state, like you must have had those days at work where you just, or whatever it is, where you're just like grinded and just like, how do I describe it? Like impaled on the mundanity of human existence. Like, please tell me you understand that, because that's all too commonly described. And then you have the inverse of that, like you're on holiday, you're at the beach, the weather's really nice, sun's shining, and there's this inherent shimmer to everything, and there's the beauteous nature of like deep appreciation for life based on the simple phenomena arising. But at no point in this, so I often equate that, so you can go in the ordinary waking state of consciousness, you can be just dreaming, the equivalent of the black and white dream, or you can be in the like, you can be having a pleasant dream or an unpleasant dream. Some people it's nightmare, some people it's an embodiment of the darkest possible phenomena available. I'm not precluding suffering as part of this, and like it can be as elated as possible, but you're still fundamentally in the same state of consciousness, but the tone of it is predetermined by the environment, the atmosphere, the experiences happening to you, as though they're fully immersive. There's no like questioning that like this is fundamentally the realist thing. So there's no inherent value one way or the other, but it is as though you're dreaming. I take some quandary with using the asleep awake in the waking state thing to do with people talking about spiritual awakening and enlightenment, but it's an apt term for this descriptive structure, and it's as though you're having a dream of one category or the other, or some sort of miasma right in the middle of both. Like sometimes it's dark nightmare, sometimes it's beautiful, but inherently there's this total immersion in reality as though it's fundamental and real. Now, for anyone who's had these have become the less common experiences after this. For anyone who's had any altered state of consciousness, be that meditation, cannabis, or up in the depths of which, or the heights of which you can expand your consciousness, however that may be done, there is the rescindance, I use that word very specifically, the rescindance of ego, as we would call it in the West, the rescindance of personae, of the identity proper, like the identity proper, the shell which inhouses the deeper parts of the psyche, such as the subconscious, the personal subconscious, the subconscious, the collective unconscious, the unconscious, the personal unconscious, all these sort of things. And like there's just like cannabis is a great example of this. Like a lot of people I've spoken to refer to cannabis as though it's almost similar to having a dream in the waking state, and then and associated with higher and higher doses of the psychedelics, or associated with deeper states of meditation, you get this with varying degrees of intensity, a rescindance of your individual identity. We haven't got to the self yet. We're just on the like in comparison to the waking state of consciousness that we described ad infinitum previously, there's this sense that the lines between the internal lines that define you as a person has become slightly more hazy. And we call that the ego in the West, and in the spiritual tradition as well as the psychological tradition, as though it's like a shield. Some people refer to it, so like left brain and right brain. I know it's not quite an accurate dichotomy, but I've heard it referred to as the master is the right brain and the emissary is the left brain, as though like the deeper part of your thought structure and identity is in this kind of chaotic right-brained, partially dreaming state. And when you have this rescindence of ego, it's where I've seen it before in people who, especially with cannabis, I've seen like the left eye sort of becomes less dominant, and that, apparently in schizophrenia there's evidence to suggest that you become more right lobally dominant, and that's associated with psychedelic, psychotic, and awakening states. So this partial rescindence, the left eye becomes more passive, and that's where the emissary, your self-affirmed I, and not at a deep level, but like the I think I've elaborated on it enough, but yeah, the rescindence partially of your self-identification begins. It becomes more malleable. Your identity becomes more, and you might get thoughts and associated experiences that are novel and fundamentally different from the waking state of consciousness. So this is where it gets a bit deeper, so I'm going to pause and then come back. So further on from that beginning permeability of the identity, you can go. So this is just vertically at the moment. We have other axes of exploration to talk about, but upwardly, you get an increased. So the ego, as we've described it for this point, for the sake of argument, can rescind, and I'm of the impression that like that's something that can be fundamentally removed, but only permanently by death, like, or total annihilation of your brain, neither of which are desirable outcomes. But it can rescind. It can be dissolved and become part of the whole. So if you use this facial, it can become part of the brain rather than the dominating capacity of the brain. To use a physical example, and then it can also, like identity-wise, like with the beginning burgeoning state of the rescindence of the ego, you get a greater degree, and people often describe like a depth of awareness, or like an additional vividness, and like a kind of quality of deep introspection. And interestingly, the cannabis I referenced before, I've chatted to people about this, and there's this conception, basically it affects your short-term memory. I hear it affects your short-term memory. Have you ever mentioned that it might affect your short-term memory? But yeah, like that affecting of the short-term memory naturally draws you into your long-term memory. So that can precipitate hallucinations, if at some level. It can precipitate multiple states, but it's as though you're it's quite a deeply meditative state in some regards, because the lack of presence in current reality allows you to explore more vastly, like the other kind of memory-based dimensions of your existence. And this doesn't have to be done with cannabis. It's just a easy pill for every other example of how that works. Like, but beyond that, you get into further realms of dissolution, because you can be in an egoless, or not quite truly egoless, but you can be in a rescinded ego state, and you still have some form of identity. It's not as though at this next stage of ascension through these levels I'm describing, it's not as though you suddenly don't recognize yourself, or that it's like, although that can be the case, it's as though a more fundamental like self emerges, like self with a lowercase s, like a self emerges that's not. I don't like the notion of demonizing the ego. The ego is like the thing that means you can drive your car safely. Do you know what I mean? Like, to quote Joe Rogan, you don't want to be high all the time. Like, there's shit you need to do with your ego, and it's important. And I would even argue like the ego is like the humanity, the human experiencing these things. It's like, anyway, I could waffle on about that for hours, but the idea I'm trying to drive at is that there becomes a, I've heard it described, Ken Wilber talks about this a little bit, like the idea that what was once the whole, so until you have this first ego recension, and that can happen through innumerable ways, but the rescindance of the ego leads to it kind of becoming an aspect of a more expansive whole. And then, unfortunately, the bad news is that more expansive whole can drop away as well in deeper and deeper states of altered states of consciousness, to the point where the entire, and we won't go that far yet, but the entire conception of your own existence can drop away. And I've never done it, obviously, but I've heard people describe 5-MeO-DMT that way. I think Mike Tyson talked about it, and Joe Rogan, which I'm sure you're on the internet, you can Google that, and you can YouTube that and see what you find. But a lot of people talk, I haven't gone through this, but a total annihilation of yourself from existence is the zenith, the pinnacle of that experience. I've not had that myself, at least not that I recall. But there are varying gradients of which, like the notion of, the Buddhists talk about this, especially in certain sects, like this well, just in general, it's a Buddhist notion, like the subject-object divide. So at the level of ego, like I am me, you're you, we're different, we're separate, we're nothing. And then ascending through varying gradients of oneness with reality, you lose the subject-object divide until the experience, this I have had, the experience is as though everything is a manifestation of yourself, and that yourself is a manifestation of everything. So, believe it or not, that's just the preface of this video. So, see you in the next section. So, as I said, the last section, believe it or not, that's just the preface of what we're talking about. So, this isn't a video about lucid dreaming, so I'm not going to cover that aspect of it. This video, as the title says, is about why reality is a hallucination, or why I think or perceive or believe that reality is a hallucination. And to cover that a little bit in preface, this isn't my notion, this is the notion of magic with a K, and Buddhism. I'll come more back to magic with a K, but the idea that reality is purely mental, like it's as though it's like all phenomena arise purely in the psyche or the mind, and that nothing is real. Now, oddly, that is backed by some current neuroscience as well, which suggests, quite logically, I'm not equipped to have the full discussion about that, but like quite logically suggests that, like, so if you limit the function of your eyes by doing that, that's about when you turn your head and with the movement of your pupils, that's about the actual limits of what your eyes are actually seeing, like physically drawing that data in from objective reality. But then the remainder of it is half memory, half hallucination, half imagination, half this like fantastic construction of the brain that creates this sense as though an objective reality exists. And furthermore to that, we know, and it's actually been proven in multiple studies with in cognitive modeling and computer simulations, where they've shown quite rightly that, like, by necessity of our evolution, I've talked about this in other videos, by necessity of our evolution, what we perceive is only that which we require for our biological survival. Like we've evolved to for example, carnivores see in black and white because they don't eat vegetables, so they don't need to distinguish between different colours. They have an enhanced sense of smell to see if something's rancid or edible or not edible. Whereas omnivores and herbivores see in colour, and that's just a limited example of how like your evolution and your needs determines what perceptions of reality you have. To quote Incubus song, like since the publication of the charted magnet, the spectrum of what was it? Let me see if I get this. Since the publication of the charted spectrum of magnet, I don't know. Basically, like since we discovered like all these other dimensions of light and vibration, like the electromagnetic spectrum, we realised that what we see and perceive is less than 1/1,000,000th of reality. That kind of notion, like it's an older notion. This is nothing novel. But what I'm adding to it is this inference that like everything you're perceiving, other than these very limited sensory windows, is a hallucination, and we don't know to what extent, how far down the scope that goes, because we're experiencing the same objective electromagnetic stimuli and phenomena. The old thought experiment of like, you know, you could be seeing red, I could be seeing blue, but because the colour blue and the colour red, we're identifying the same objective electromagnetic field. Like we both agree that that thing in this phenomenological reality is the same thing, so we have the same word for it. Furthermore, before we get any more complicated, there's also been proven in a few different studies, like some tribesmen, I believe, who had no word for the colour blue. So back to blue again. They had like about 50 different shades of green, like incredibly because they lived in nature, but no ability to noticeably marker away that blue is a distinct thing, and that they had this massive array of greens, but no blue. They couldn't distinguish blue as a separate colour. And this adds, I'll get to why this makes sense. So like the degree to which having a name for something makes it perceptible cannot be overstated in the argument I'm making here. Like I don't have a qualified enough scientific explanation to explain it any further, but there is, in the field of magic, there's very much this notional thing of like, and just in general, if you can see it in your own perception, like the idea that like without like, I don't know, teaching a child about their emotions, simple example, like until you know what love is as an abstraction from experience, you might not necessarily, you might have some feeling, but it's not clarified under this banner of love, like, or you might, like a good example, my son got very angry once, and I said, what you're experiencing is anger, and then he's like, right, other people experience this, now I can address it, now I can navigate it, now I can manage it, now I have some meta substance in my brain with which to ascribe that name to this feeling, and now it develops, now it can be dealt with, now it can be processed, now it can be perceived as what it is, instead of this just uncontrollable feeling of adrenaline and emotion that you have no word for, like stuff like that. So where did I get to? Yeah, so to come right the way back to the beginning, reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. I would say reality is a dream, albeit a recurrent one. That's the fundamental argument. We will dive into that next. So, reality is dream, albeit a recurrent one. Strong statement. Let's validate that and provide some logic, if not some sincere experience. Whatever you may think of schizophrenia, I have my, as a consequence of being schizophrenic, I experience things that are abnormal in perception. Like I experience perceptions of things other people don't, and that's not everyone doesn't. But like I think I've said in previous videos, like I'm extremely lucky that basically the entirety of my schizophrenic, I'm not even going to put air quotes on actually, my schizophrenic experiences are religious, like spiritually. So you've got the Om symbol here, and I've got all, this is my little shrine that I'm in the shed at the moment, which I've dedicated to spiritual reflection, and that's why I'm doing this video here. It seemed appropriate. As a consequence of the following, I've realised that life is a recurrent dream, as far as I experience it, with different boundaries depending on what state of consciousness you're in. So, advance warning: here comes the woo and the crazy shit. So, the fundamental realization came from. So, as discussed in previous videos, I was genuinely convinced I had died at one point and gone to another dimension that was entirely unpleasant, which I labelled hell. Right? That didn't stay with me, but that stayed with me for 6 years, and that gave me a long time to really reflect on like what is real, because that's the very notional point that is expressed to you when you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. It's like your perceptions aren't real, right? That's the key factor. That hallucinations and correlating, delusional frameworks, delusional maps of reality that are either objectively diametric to objective reality, so like measurably not real, measurably false in some cases, and not perceptible by others in the case of hallucinations. So there's the two primary positive symptoms of schizophrenia is hallucinations and delusions. So as a consequence of that, rather than going, okay, so let's figure out which one of those experiences isn't real and try and destroy it, which is most of what I've done through clinical psychology and medications, which serve their purpose. Do not stop your medications on my account if you are schizophrenic. But yeah, like, or antipsychotics in general, or anything like that. Or like, I'm not a doctor, I'm a crazy person, it's cool, don't take my advice. But the thought that this led me to was like, how far down into my experience do I get before something that is real starts being measurable, and then build up from the outside in again, which is quite fascinating. Which led me to the very fundamental question, which the Buddha kind of presents, and this idea that samsara is an illusory, like Mara, these like illusory levels of reality, where there is something fundamentally untrue or false or like holographic about samsara, like the normal ordinary waking state of unenlightened consciousness, as pretentious as that sounds. And I'm not claiming to be enlightened. I think I am, but I'm schizophrenic, and I know I'm not enlightened. So it's a paradigm, paradox, and cognitive dissonance that's fascinating. I'm not enlightened, don't think. I'm not claiming to be, that's the point I'm making. So there's this distinct answer that comes forth when you're like, what is real? Like what is real? If so much, so to explain a little bit of depth, like when I thought I died, I'm not saying like, oh, I thought I died, I kind of had this feeling like paranoia, something like, no, I experienced that I had died and gone to another reality. Like, it was completely congruent in all hallucinations. So the visual, auditory, tactile, including in my case, because I have this vividly, how would you call it? Like empathic, or you would imagine it empathically, like a kind of emotional resonance that made all these other stimuli, like all my senses were completely immersed in that, as though it was to the point where it was completely for like 6 years unquestionable to me that could have happened. That any other thing could be happening, and it took a lot of work to kind of get out of that and progress from that, which is why I got diagnosed in a nutshell. But the question goes right the way down, because it's like, well, if I can change the emotional, visual, auditory, sensory in every level, tactile and emotion-sympathetic level of reality can be fundamentally changed by a belief or you see my point, I hope. Like, what could that power have as an alternate? So like, could heaven exist? And then but the fundamental question, not heaven or hell, is like the reality, especially in the case of someone who's schizophrenic or experiences altered states of consciousness naturally or spontaneously or through trauma or through drug abuse or whatever it may be, like the spontaneous, all immersive, altered reality that you can enter with fundamentally different phenomena that influence your entire personality from the outside in. Like, if all of that can be false, then how else could that apply to other people? Like to what degree are we all living partially in our imaginations and in a large, all-consuming and measurably false projection of reality? So I'm going to think on that before I articulate any further. So, even for the non-neurodivergent schizophreniform types, given enough thought, the questioning, like, especially for religious people or spiritual people or people that like, or philosophical people or scientists, anyone, it seems just like an overtly pertinent question. That like, what is the boundary between what is actually happening in the multiform, entire electromagnetic spectrum, infinite cosmic algorithm? Like, I actually reminded myself to say that, like earlier on in my notes, like the idea that like there is just this infinite, like, sincerely, if you believe that the universe is infinite, it's not a stretch of the imagination, but it's hard to conceive of. Like, the notion that like, so I'm a pinhole of consciousness, the center of my own universe, and then outside me, to actually believe that there is anything outside you requires feedback coming inwards. But then it's like, to what extent is it evident that our senses can be trusted at any level? Like, we, as mentioned earlier, like we know that, like, in the brain at least, this entire thing is like 99, I don't have the exact figure, but it's like the majority of it, the significant majority of it, is just made up by your brain. Like, and we also know from the fact that so for example, you can take the lens off your eyelid when you have laser eye surgery. There was this guy who had a lens without a UV filter, and he could see ultraviolet. And it's like, that's a biological block. It's to protect our eyes from sun damage, so we've evolved that. But without that filter, he could see this whole other incredibly vivid, bioluminescent, complex thing that other creatures can see. And my point is that we do not know the extent to which our senses limit us, and the assumption that we have any grasp, other than through the medium of these limited senses, of what fundamentally reality exists like, it just seems a bit far-fetched, to be perfectly honest. Because, let me explain this. So, you are watching this video now, I am talking, you are hearing the words I'm saying through your ears, but someone else watching the video, also hearing through the exact same system of sensory input, will have a totally different intellectual, psychospiritual filter dependent on what they've experienced. So the information you actually receive from what I'm saying will be almost infinitely different per person in terms of complexity of experience that's being mapped onto what I'm actually projecting into reality with my voice. Like, I feel very passionately about this. So in a nutshell, yeah, I had the deep revelation that rather than being an illusion, albeit a persistent one, maybe even rather than being a dream, although albeit a recurrent one, and then we're going to go into a deeper section just after this. We haven't quite gone all the way in yet with this crazy theory, but that reality itself is a kind of, ironically, when I just hit the critical point, the SD card ran out of space. Reality itself is not just illusory. It's a hallucination. We are generating from the outside in our entire map of reality, and that can be evidenced through like a variety of ways I'm probably not skilled enough to articulate. But for example, like at some level of your cognition, so I'm sat here in a chair, so I'm sat in a chair that's mapped, and I can tune into it, but until I tune into it, I'm almost blissfully unaware that I'm in that chair. It's just a feature of my like subconscious. And like, if you think about the degree to which we map things, like if I expand my thinking, like, oh, I'm in a shed and it's got beautiful material and it's in my home and in my hometown and it's surrounded by these things, and then there's like a whole, you wouldn't believe the complexity of your mental map of reality that is existing just beyond where you're focusing. Like, the easy way to evidence that is like, try and visualize going to your local shop step by step. You can probably do it if you focus hard enough. And that the existence of that thing in your mind is a map of reality that exists regardless of whether you're focusing on it. It's not like, this is where I need to be very careful with my language. It's not as though that thing exists to your conscious mind. Like the fallacy people always say, like, is the moon even really there if you aren't aware of it? It's like, well, yes it is, but your perception of whether the moon exists can be dramatically altered depending on your focus. I would say measurably this reality exists, but like the medium through which you're experiencing it is borderline imaginary, but like most appropriately hallucinatory. It's a dream that you're experiencing. Like, even saying this to myself looking in the camera is pretty surreal, because it's like, to me, that is my, when I boiled that question down to its fundamental answer, it was like, everything is a dream. Because I couldn't, especially being schizophrenic, you can't distinguish at some fundamental level between what's real and not real, from the schizophrenic perspective. But then, like, I can point these things out to neurotypical people, and Buddhists are extremely effective at doing this, especially the people I've spoken to about this particular topic. Is like, there is some level to which, like, I don't know, how can I put it? So you're hallucinating out, and within the spectrum of your subconscious is this vast field of like things that you think are there and you know are there in the kind of objective reality, but the actual nature of that objective reality is completely obscured by your senses, to the point where, like, it might as well be 99.99999% not there. Like, this is the real one that'll fuck with your mind if you think about it too much. Is like the only way in which you know that objective reality exists is when you're present in it. So back to the dream thing, like when you're in a dream, like I said earlier, and you accept that on face value the experience you're having is a reality, and until you question that and become lucid in the dream, your mind is, the majority of the time until you're trained it, blissfully unaware that that's a dream. And that I can guarantee you, whether you realize it or not, that will be your experience as well until you start implementing structures within which to awaken in the dream state. And so this is the final point I'm trying to get around to in my awfully pretentious, extremely verbose way, is that, like, and this is the bit where I have to preface it with, like, I'm schizophrenic, labelled as delusional. My entire religious experience of reality is considered psychiatrically as a malfunction of the brain because it cannot be objectively measured. I hate describing it like that, but it's a factor that needs to be taken into account. So, like, what I'm driving at is that there is some level to which you can, and like, for people who are religious and spiritual, this is a very easy vernacular to just throw out half-assedly without really understanding. Some people, this isn't everyone, of course, that's profoundly rude of me to say, but a lot of people will throw out this word awakening or enlightenment, or this kind of like deeply powerful word to describe, like, very unformed experience, not uninformed, but like very like just lie, basically. It's like an aspiration. It's a common delusion that no one quite is willing to make claim to significantly enough to actually follow it through to its logical conclusion, which is this. And I talked about this in my thought broadcasting video as well. It's like the degree to which our senses limit our awareness of this reality, the likelihood of two things increases the more you explore it. One, that there could be other factors in reality, say people might talk about spirits, entities, telepathy, this whole massive conglomerate of things that people with schizophrenia experience. Without having those experiences, how can you possibly determine, and I'm not saying I have, but how could you possibly determine or falsify or prove, either way, the validity of something that, was it, 1 in 10, so what is that, like yeah, 10% of the population experiences, and then the people making the diagnoses are the other 90%. So it's like across the board. You may find this, I may sound like a madman to you, I may sound like, oh, that makes complete sense, or some gradient in between the two, but I get the feeling, or I intuit that people who've had hallucinations are far more likely to kind of relate to this. But part of the point of this channel is to provide a articulate perspective on that for people not only that have those experiences but that don't. Like the idea that otherworldly, supernatural, beyond the senses experiences could happen becomes at least less of a joke. Do you know what I mean? Like we mediate our entire perception of reality through a limited sensory experience, which we know is woefully inaccurate. Now, you can get caught up in your own bullshit. You can just fantasize. You can become dangerously phantom, with a PH, like phantom experiences can start to happen, and it's like, this is a whole kettle of fish that I don't want to open. A whole can of worms. So I just done a malapropism, but whatever. It's a whole kettle of fish. Like, the extent to which people have been exploring this in human culture for like thousands and thousands of years is at least worth giving it some thought on, neurodivergent or not. So yeah, that's about as articulate as I can be about it. I'm fundamentally arguing that our entire perception of reality is a hallucination, and there's science to back that up and logic to back that up, and if you can do your own research and then comment and tell me what you found, what validates or invalidates my point. And then the other side of it is, like, as I've said in previous videos, like, you cannot explain, like, it is impossible to relate to something phenomenological in reality until you've experienced it. Like, and like the people that make the best treaters of depression are people that have suffered from and overcome depression. People blah 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 blah. Like the notion that like someone with a pencil and a book who talks to you and has come with the presupposition that you're broken and full of shit and delusional and dangerous, like as helpful as that linguistic structure can be to keep you safe and protected, like it, and I value it. Like I use psychological terms specifically because it's a totally valid interpretive framework within which to digest reality. But like the only thing it misses when it goes especially wrong is that like the presupposition that their lack of this cognitive structure, that lack of ability to perceive those altered dimensions, is the basis of reality. And I would just infer that it's not. And I think that was a pretty long lecture validating why I think that. So I'm David Bradley, aka Schizophrenia Forums. Like, subscribe, share with people you might find it interesting. Blessings, peace and goodwill, and so on and so forth. Have a wonderful day.